If you look at any sort of natural language prompt, whether it's ChatGPT or anything else, and you think about what are the characteristics of the database that's going to support that interactivity, and I think that's where ClickHouse's low latency characteristics really put it apart from others to be the backend to a lot of these LLM providers. Tesla is on record. They're ingesting 1 billion events per second into ClickHouse. Typically, you're very constrained on how much data you can store and sampling and retention periods. And I think just because ClickHouse compresses and stores data so efficiently, you have a lot more freedom there.
A lot of your customers are obviously racing towards AGI. In that context, does the database kind of become obsolete?
I think the database is going to be more important than ever. We had some traditionally static dashboards. They would refresh periodically. But I wanted to just start asking ad hoc questions about how the company was performing and not go to a data analyst. I want to just ask a prompt. If you think about that as traditional BI, I just really think that sector is just going to be ripe for disruption with the emergence of these AI capabilities.
So Aaron, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
So for folks who don't know, Aaron is the CEO and co-founder of ClickHouse. ClickHouse is a fast-moving, growing company, just raised around at a $6 billion valuation with like thousands of customers. Before ClickHouse, Aaron was a CRO at Elastic, where he kind of took the company public. And before that, he was super early at Salesforce. I think less than 200 people, worked very closely with Benioff and was the SVP sales there. So an amazing career journey, Aaron. So excited to have you today. Join us.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
So I was very curious, right? Like, what is a one-liner for folks who don't understand ClickHouse? How would you describe it to them?
A one-liner. It's an open source analytical database that satisfies a very diverse set of use cases, from data warehousing to observability to real-time analytics.
And what does ClickHouse do better than anyone else, if you had to describe it in one line?
Describe it on one line. Well, it would come down to 3 different characteristics, and it's largely around price, performance, and scalability. And there's a lot of proof points behind that claim, which a lot of database companies can make. But we've got some of the fastest growing companies in the world, including OpenAI, Anthropic, and others that are leveraging the technology as their data volumes are exploding.
I was actually looking, like, you guys work with all these large model companies, which is pretty unique. What will people find surprising, like how they are using you, like what you can share? Obviously, the labs are pretty secretive about their work, but curious to know that.
Fortunately, these companies are on record publicly about how they're using ClickHouse. They love talking about the diverse set of use cases that they're deploying the technology around. For example, Anthropic is using us for observability. And they recently spoke at our user conference in San Francisco. There's a 10-minute recording out there for other companies that are struggling with the same explosion of data around time series, logs, metrics, and traces. You can hear about Anthropic's using us. OpenAI, again, is using us around observability in one area, and they're using us around transaction analytics in another area as the backend to a customer-facing application. And so, yeah, it ranges, honestly. We're the backend to LangChain's LangSmith service. We're the backend to Weights and Biases Weave product. Vercel is using us to expose build logs to their customers. So those were more customer-facing kind of B2B SaaS applications, but around LLM observability and web analytics.
And the Anthropic story was pretty crazy. I was actually like listening to their video, and I read somewhere like they actually asked Claude, like, what is the best database to shift? And like ClickHouse was the answer, and that's like how they kind of started talking to you as well. I was like, wow, that's great. Is that true?
That is true, and I'm so glad that you listened to that testimony. It's so powerful in terms of the benefits that they're getting from the technology, and they're using our cloud binary, ClickHouse Cloud. Whereas some companies like OpenAI are using the open source distribution, and others like LangChain and Vercel and Weights and Biases are using our hosted service, ClickHouse Cloud.
So you guys work with OpenAI as well, and I saw OpenAI acquired like a database company as well. How does that relate to ClickHouse? What's your perspective on that?
There's a lot of consolidation occurring in the industry. You mentioned OpenAI's acquisition of another company that provides real-time analytics. And so, from my understanding, that team is still in place inside of OpenAI and doing extremely well on some of their own internal use cases. But there hasn't been, from my understanding, meaningful overlap between how they're leveraging ClickHouse internally and the acquisitions that they're making in the category.
So ClickHouse is an open source product. And one thing I always like wonder that with from an open source perspective, right, like what prevents a company like OpenAI or AWS to be like, hey, let's throw some engineers at this. We have so much capital. Let's build a managed service internally for our own use case, maybe in AWS's case. Hey, let's offer it to like folks outside. What's a unique moat in this case in your company?
The moat to prevent a company from taking the open source and offering it as a managed service.
Yeah.
And well, obviously, we lived through that at Elastic with AWS's redistribution of Elasticsearch and then ultimately their fork of Elasticsearch to OpenSearch. And so having kind of been through that before, it's an obvious risk whenever you have a open source project governed under a very permissive license. And in the case of ClickHouse, we're still governed under an Apache 2 license, and that, is extremely permissive. Companies can, build solutions on top of it. They can redistribute it as a managed service. And so that is always an inherent risk that you take. But the popularity of the project is increasing so quickly, and this the number of contributors around the world that are advancing the feature set is growing at such an extraordinary rate. And we believe that we're uniquely positioned with the creator of ClickHouse is one of my co-founders, Alexei Milovidov, and his team of engineers based in Amsterdam that really are helping prioritize the roadmap and the feature set. And so we like to make the claim that we employ all of the committers behind the main branch of ClickHouse, and I think in doing so we can maintain a competitive advantage to other distributions of ClickHouse that are in the market. And the other thing is when we designed our managed service, ClickHouse Cloud, we rewrote the underlying table engine to support the separation of compute and storage to ensure that the offering was differentiated from the open source. And what do I mean by that? Well, the data is stored in object storage, so something like S3 or GCS or Azure Blob Storage, and then the compute nodes are stateless, and that enables auto scaling and idling, and so it makes it considerably more resource efficient to use our managed service than to self-host the technology. We still obviously support a number of high-profile companies like ServiceNow and IBM and Disney and others that made the decision to self-host the software. But as you mentioned earlier, we have thousands of companies over the last 2.5 years that have moved to our managed service, ClickHouse Cloud.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. So one thing I want to slightly, go back to your journey because I think that's really interesting. So you were early at Salesforce, less than 200 people, rode the wave. Salesforce is the iconic SaaS company. You joined Elastic as a CRO, took the company public, and then you decided to take a pretty big bet. A lot of people at that point are like, this is awesome. They may go join another company as a CRO or maybe a growth stage company, which is already pretty well funded as a CEO. But you took an asymmetric bet, decided to build a company as a spin out of Yandex. What were you thinking? Like, share a bit about your thinking process, your frameworks you applied.
Well, as you mentioned, I was very fortunate to join Salesforce, 23 years ago in early 2002 when it was a small 3-year-old startup, and really had a front row seat to Mark's brilliance for the course of 12 years, and just learned so much along the way. And then, as you mentioned, I joined Elastic in 2014, and we grew that company very quickly, and a number of us helped take the company public in 2018, and then I spent a few more years before stepping out during COVID. And at the time, this was kind of peak ZERP 2020, 2021. I was at the point in my career in my mid 40s where I really wanted to be in charge and running a company, and I had a couple different options. I could have taken over from a very strong product founder who wanted to pair up with a CEO more on the go-to-market side. I could kind of stay in my lane and become a CRO at a number of other later stage private companies that were looking for somebody with my background, or I could start a company. And most people start companies in their mid 20s, not in their mid 40s, because it takes so long to to establish product market fit and all of the things that go around company building. And so what was so exciting to me about ClickHouse was I felt like I had a head start because the database had been under development for over 10 years. It had been open sourced in 2016 and was already being used by thousands of companies around the world, from Deutsche Bank to Microsoft to Uber and eBay. And so I felt like, we already had product market fit. When I inventoried the category of analytical databases in the market, ClickHouse was evidently just surging in popularity, and I think kind of running away with that specific category. And then when I really started to understand the other diverse set of use cases that ClickHouse is being used for around data warehousing, ClickHouse is short for Clickstream Data Warehouse. So when Alexei named it, he was already thinking about the data warehouse use case long before a lot of other hosted alternatives hit the market. And then I mentioned observability, and then when Gen AI and the Chat GPT moment occurred, ClickHouse was already powering a number of AI backends and ML workloads, and so it was just a very natural propellant for the company over the last few years in the wave of this AI boom.
So you mentioned, like, you were at Elastic, and as I was researching Elastic and ClickHouse, I saw that some of Elastic's customers started moving. You mentioned some of them, Uber, Disney, started moving to ClickHouse. You're obviously the CRO, and that's coming up in the competitive kind of conversations as well. And I'm sure, like, you lose business to other companies as well. What made ClickHouse stand out to you? Be like, hey, no, this is not just like a edge case. This is actually a real competitor, real moat, company with a real moat.
I mean, I think if you listen to Anthropic's use case, and if you listen to Tesla talk about how they're ingesting 1 billion events per second into ClickHouse with unlimited retention, and then running, thousands of concurrent queries against that data set and getting the results in hundreds of milliseconds, it really boils down to a combination of price and performance. And there's just very few databases in the market that can ingest the volumes of data that are occurring efficiently, store that data, compress it with orders of magnitude more efficiency than other databases, and then provide the same query latency benefits that you get with these low latency real-time use cases. And so it's not just one implementation detail that leads to why people choose ClickHouse. It's typically a combination of a variety of those factors.
So ClickHouse was Lexi, I think your co-founder had kind of done this project at Yandex, like a Russian company, and you had to like spin it out of that. Like I actually didn't know that before I started looking into it. Pretty interesting story. Like what were some key kind of processes you were able to do there, like key frameworks which helped you do it really well? Some learnings you can share with their listeners.
Yeah, well, so back in early 2021, I was introduced to Arkady Velos, the founder and CEO of Yandex, and his executive team. And they then introduced me to Alexei Milovidov and his team, who were at the time in Moscow. And we started to kind of romanticize about what a company would look like as an independent organization behind ClickHouse, the open source project, and what a business model would be to take a database and offer it as a hosted service. And it took about a year to pull this off, frankly. There was a lot of complexity around it. Yandex at the time was a public company, $30 billion market cap. So anytime you're taking intellectual property out of a company like that, there's a lot of regulatory considerations. There had to be a lot of trust built between Alexei, his team, and myself. I was able to gather quite a bit of investor interest in doing this with some very prominent venture capitalists who, in the world of open source infrastructure, have a great track record, and that specifically is Mike Volpe and Peter Fenton, and so we all kind of got around a table and said, hey, this is a project worth pursuing, and it wasn't obvious at the time that we were going to be able to pull it off. You had all the cultural differences, me in Silicon Valley, Alexei and his team in Moscow, and in a condition of the company's formation, frankly, was that Alexei and his team needed to leave Russia. And this was 6 months before Russia invaded Ukraine. So it wasn't like I had this foresight that a war was going to break out that I'd, have this implication around. But I knew enough that we were going to be building a hosted service, and having engineers coding on a Russian network was problematic. And so I asked Alexei and his team if they would be willing to relocate to somewhere in Western Europe, and we landed on Amsterdam. And so we moved the team. after we incorporated the company, and we had $50 million of capital to support that relocation, and they kind of traded in their Yandex RSUs for early stage stock options, which at the time wasn't an obvious trade. And in retrospect, I think it was a very wise trade for them. And fast forward, 4.5 years to the current day, and I think they're quite happy. They're living happily in the Netherlands. It's a wonderful environment for this engineering team, and we've grown the team considerably. What was originally 12 engineers is now over 50 in the Netherlands, and it's really enabled us to accelerate the roadmap around ClickHouse. And so, yeah, there's a lot more to the backstory, but that's the long and short of it. We're a Delaware Corp, headquartered here in Silicon Valley, where I'm based and where I am today. And we've got a great group of investors behind us. We added to that list earlier this year in the financing that you referenced earlier, where we did a $350 million Series C, I guess you would technically call it, and added a good group of new investors that was led by Khosla Ventures and Bond, IVP, Bessemer, Battery, some great new investors, and then we had great participation from our existing investors, so Cotu, Altimeter, Lightspeed, Benchmark, Index,
All the
Hanabi
big names.
Capital. Yeah, and we added some great new firms as well. So we, I think we've got a really good group of people trying to help shape and form the company.
No, that's really impressive, right? Like you obviously hear about people starting from 0 to 1, going the journey. This is a very unique story in a different way. And you kind of guys getting to the stage you are, that's amazingly impressive. One, I think you mentioned about like the retrospect and the hindsight, right? Some of the decisions you made, which allowed you to be successful, not ClickHouse. So you've seen Salesforce succeed, you've seen Elastic succeed. What are some decisions you look back and, at that moment, the decision was, I'm not really sure it's a 50-50, but in hindsight, you like, that's an amazing thing and that made the company successful. Any story you can share with Salesforce, Elastic, anyone?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, we talked about Alexei and his team and the dependency on them joining the company, but I felt that I needed a third co-founder to lead product and engineering. Alexei, the creator of ClickHouse, is our chief technology officer, but I was really looking for somebody to join the two of us who had been building distributed systems around open source databases for as long as I've been doing go to market. And I found that individual in Yuri Israelevsky, and I'd met Yuri when he was at Netflix running platform engineering. I think at the time he was AWS's largest customer. He led Netflix's migration to the cloud, and this was over 10 years ago. And so, when I was starting the company, I basically paused the process to recruit Yuri. He had since left Netflix and gone to Google and was a senior VP at Google running the cloud console and their serverless products within Google Cloud. And it took a while to kind of convince him to leave his plush senior job at Google. And this is, middle of 2021. So life was pretty good back then for Google execs, and to start a company with me. And I think, that single-handedly, I think changed the trajectory of the company, just because you had this brilliant engineer in Alexei, the creator of ClickHouse. You had, Yuri, this incredibly accomplished Silicon Valley enterprise software executive who, again, has been building services around open source databases at just iconic companies. And then you had my background on distribution. And so I think that would, if you said, hey, you put a gun to my head and say, pick one thing that you would look back on as just like a fundamental difference maker, that would be, adding Yuri to the mix with Alexei and I. And then there's a lot of lessons learned from my time at Salesforce and Elastic, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of those if you're interested.
Would be very curious to like hear any story from Salesforce days, specifically with like how we now have the AI wave where SaaS companies are struggling.
Well, I mean, as you know, ClickHouse is an infrastructure company and Salesforce is an applications company. So we cater to very different personas and users, but there's still this concept of a community. And in Salesforce's case, it's Dreamforce, this annual conference in San Francisco that I just went to a few weeks ago. And but Salesforce has just done an amazing job over the course of 20 years developing the community of administrators and users, and it's the same thing in open source, where you have this kind of evangelical community around the world. And so we we host up to 100 events a year around the world where we invite developers and users of ClickHouse or people interested into events, and we hear about their use cases. And that's exactly how we got Anthropic and Tesla and OpenAI to talk about how they're using the software. I really learned that from Mark. Mark just ingrained in us the importance of customer anecdotes and testimonies. And, you'd sit there at a conference and you'd hear, the CIO of Merrill Lynch or Cisco Systems talk about how they're using Salesforce. And I said, we have to replicate that. We have to get our users talking about the benefits of the software. And you heard it with Anthropic's presentation. And so that was one. And then in terms of product development, I think what Salesforce did very well was, they started with one product, Salesforce Automation, and what now I think is referred to as the Sales Cloud, but at the time it was called SFA. And then they incubated what's now Service Cloud or service and support. But they didn't really go after that market until they established dominance in one product. And so they had this kind of rolling thunder of product lines. Then it was marketing automation or the marketing cloud, and then it was the underlying platform, and then data.com and Heroku. And so they just did an incredible job of diversifying their product base so they could go back to their customers and open new markets. And I think, that is just a wonderful playbook for other companies that want to enter new solution areas to get into, to become a dominant provider in one solution area while you kind of incubate other product areas and then go full bore versus trying to simultaneously do everything at once. I've found that to be a more challenging approach.
So I think going a bit about like the product, like I was looking at like ClickHouse, and I worked at Snowflake. Snowflake acquired one of my companies, so I spent some time there. And I was very curious about ClickHouse is that you guys are competing on the speed in the real-time analytics side with Databricks and Snowflake, and then also on the observability side with Datadog. So like two pretty big, massive markets. How do you think about resource allocation as an amazing go-to-market leader, and also on the product side?
Yeah, so you mentioned Snowflake specifically, and great company. Architecturally, we actually look quite a bit like Snowflake with the serverless offering with compute storage separation. And we talked about the different use cases. Data warehousing would be the one where we see similarities with Snowflake's customer base. But then observability, which I don't really think about Snowflake in terms of the observability use case as being a prominent vendor in that area. And then
The
you've got
Datadog.
real-time Datadog you mentioned as well. I'll talk about that in a second. And then you've got, the real-time use cases, and I talked a bit about those, like the weights and biases we product, or Klaviyo, or Attentive, or Ramp, or Vantage, where you've got high concurrency and you need low latency. You need these queries to execute in milliseconds. And I don't think about Snowflake powering that specific use case. I think about them more as a traditional data warehouse. And so, in terms of resource allocation, we've actually been quite aggressive on the M&A front. We've made 5 acquisitions over the last 4 years, and we've got several others identified. And it's been really to complement, one or several of those use cases. Like, for example, earlier this year, we acquired a technology called HyperDX, which you can think about it like a visualization layer on top of ClickHouse for observability use cases, for log exploration, session replay, real user monitoring, et cetera. So that's been able to accelerate, our story around a packaged solution for observability. Whereas historically you would need to integrate with another visualization layer. Now we've got our own native offering for, some of those use cases. We don't break our engineering and product teams up around a specific use case. Like, I don't have a data warehousing engineering team or a observability product. We have people that specialize in these areas, but the actual underlying platform is one team. We've got the data plane team that satisfies all these different use cases. We've got the control plane team. We've got integrations. We acquired a company called PeerDB middle of last year, as we saw Postgres emerge as one of the top sources of migrations to our cloud product, ahead of all the others that we've talked about. And subsequent to that acquisition, you saw Databricks acquire Neon, and Snowflake acquire Crunchy Data.
Yep.
And we've been thinking about a Postgres CDC for a long time. And so we're really excited about, this convergence of OLTP and OLAP databases, and have plans in that area as well.
Thanks for sharing that. What one kind of use case or like customer story I was very impressed by was Netflix. And Netflix, I think I'm just looking at my notes. They do 10 million events per second, and that to me is like crazy. And I was just wondering, like, what's the limit for ClickHouse? Is it like 100 million events per second, and then you have to rethink the architecture, or like, you can just go to a billion events per second? Like, how does the architecture work? What needs to change as things scale?
Well, Tesla is on record that they're ingesting a billion events per second
Oh, wow.
into ClickHouse of observability data. They've got a table with a quadrillion rows. And
That's
so
crazy.
if that's kind of the upward bound right now, and if you had asked me that question a few years ago, I don't think I would have speculated that we get into those data volumes. And they've got unlimited retention. Like typically, you're very constrained on how much data you can store and sampling and retention periods. And I think just because ClickHouse compresses and stores data so efficiently, you have a lot more freedom there.
So talking about like, the amount of events, right? Like, so one thing I've seen ClickHouse really has talked about the agentic database, and you guys really want to focus on that. As we go through these agents starting to create queries, like a human may do 50 to 100 queries a day, maybe agent may be able to do 10x, 100x of those queries, and maybe 1000x even as the models get better and better. Uh, my question is that are these the same type of queries and it's a scaling issue, or they're specifically different queries and you have to like really think about them in a different way? And that's why ClickHouse is positioned as an agentic database.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at any sort of natural language prompt, whether it's ChatGPT or anything else, and you simply ask a question, that can equate to dozens, if not up to 40 or 50 SQL queries. And you think about what are the characteristics of the database that's going to support that interactivity. And the obvious one is around low latency because it's got to write a query, it's got to hit the database, it's got to return results, it's got to interpret those results, it's got to write another query as a result of that. And those occurrences need to happen in milliseconds. And I think that's where, ClickHouse's low latency characteristics really, put it apart from others to be the backend to a lot of these LLM providers.
And do you think that like as like the scale kind of creates like happen for agents, like ClickHouse will become like the de facto kind of provider? Like you are to some extent working with all these labs. So is that kind of like where you will position yourself?
It's what we're seeing. I mean, Sierra, for example, AI, Brett Taylor's new company
Yeah.
is using ClickHouse extensively for this specific use case. We talked about LangChain, weights and biases, LangFuse, Anthropic, OpenAI. So it's pretty extensive in terms of the popularity. I was in New York a few weeks ago. We had a company called Modal Labs talk
Yeah.
about how they're using ClickHouse, which is another really exciting use case. So yeah, we're really encouraged, by the popularity specifically around, AI native companies.
So how does pricing kind of like play in this, right? Like so the consumption model Snowflake came up with was like, pretty amazing for the previous era, I think to some extent. Now if you're going into the agentic era where there for one outcome you need to do like 100 queries, some different type of situation needs to exist. How do you think about that?
It doesn't really change my thinking from a pricing standpoint. When we launched our managed service, we decided to be extremely transparent with our customers around pricing versus coming up with some opaque, obscure pricing unit like a credit, and then we disguise. How much are you paying for storage? How much are you paying for compute? How much are you paying for networking? Like I understand why companies do that because it gives them a lot of flexibility on the back end in terms of managing their cogs. But from my perspective as a customer, I really like to know what I'm paying for. And we really wanted to simplify our pricing down to as few dimensions as possible. And we primarily landed on storage and compute. And because we are live on all three major cloud providers, AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure, and I think today we're in over 30 regions around the world, which is quite an extensive footprint. And that's really been able to help the international mix of our customer base, where over half of our customers are outside of the United States. Over half of our revenue is currently coming from outside of North America. Over half of our employees are outside of the US. So we've got this great international mix. But specifically to your question, this emergence of these AI workflows really doesn't change my thinking. People still want to know exactly what they're paying for. And if you can keep it as simple as possible, and as storage prices are coming down, then it really comes down to, how much compute are you paying for? And if we can invest in things like auto scaling and idling, then it means you only pay for what you use. And you don't have to pay for all of this compute because a lot of these analytical workloads, as you know, are very spiky. And
Yeah.
you have to provision as much compute as you need for the peak load, but there may be periods when you don't want to have that compute available. You don't want to be paying for it, and that's the benefit of this serverless offering.
So if like, like we see like costs of inference significantly coming down as new models come out. And my kind of question to you is that would databases become like the database compute become like a key component of cost maybe in 2 years from now when inference costs become super cheap?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it's because storage is, as I mentioned, and as you know, is just becoming highly commoditized. And
Yeah.
so then the value sits in the compute, which is now becoming increasingly scarce. And so, yeah, that's the focus area for us. And therefore the different features that we can develop that make that resource utilization more efficient, the costs go directly back to our customers in terms of savings.
So you guys have grown like almost 300%, I think, last year, which is pretty incredible, close to 2,000 customers. Where do you think like the market is going? Like, are there net new folks joining you guys as customers, or are they coming from the Snowflakes of the world, AWSs of the world? Is that the big segment?
It's a little bit of everything. We're just getting started. So, our revenue base is significantly smaller than, for example, Snowflake's or Databricks. We've only been in the market for less than 3 years, and but things are growing very quickly. And as you mentioned, we've got several thousand customers. We add, on average between 100 and 200 new customers a month. And when I was starting the company, I said to the team, I'd love for us to look a lot more like Datadog than Snowflake, for example, in terms of PLG versus enterprise sales. And both those companies were very successful, but they approached distribution very differently. And what I saw at Datadog, it was this developer-led, PLG, try and buy, frictionless sales cycle. And Snowflake, conversely, from the outside looking in, really invested heavily on the enterprise and on their enterprise sales team, and it was effective, but it obviously took longer and cost more capital. And so when we started the company, we designed this cloud service to where a developer could come in, load their data, run their queries, add their credit card, and never need to talk to anybody in sales. And that's proven to be the case. And so the vast majority of those companies that I just mentioned just started using our service without ever talking to anybody in the sales organization, which is great. That's kind of how people, I think, want to consume these services. And so we're investing in that PLG motion, trying to make the onboarding experience as easy as possible. In the same way that Datadog made it so simple just to deploy an agent to instrument your application and start monitoring your environment. You never needed to have somebody go through this lengthy implementation process. And so that's kind of where we are today. I mentioned the international mix. It's across regions. It's across cloud providers. And we've got companies that spend, $20 a month with us. We've got companies that spend over $1 million a month with us, and everything in between.
So on the PLG side, like, you obviously talked about the onboarding. Are there any other tips you would give like folks who are starting out, maybe Series A company who's trying to figure out the PLG motion, like how they can do it better?
Well, the obvious one would be what I just said, which
Yeah.
is, design your service to where somebody can explore and experience it without ever having to talk to you.
So product
And
experience.
then Yeah, exactly. Then you can implement all sorts of telemetry to understand, where the bottlenecks are with the onboarding experience and why people are falling off, and then how you can increase conversion. Because it all starts at the top of the funnel in terms of people that are visiting your website. Then you want those individuals to consume content, start a trial, load their data, and as you go down, you get a higher intent to buy. But each one of those steps, you can optimize the experience and compress the time a user goes from one step to the next, with the ultimate step being that they're actually in production, either with a credit card down or they've made an annual commitment and they're using the service. And then, the ultimate test of that is, are they willing to go on record and be, a referenceable customer? And when we, talk to our sales organization about the deals in the pipeline, one of the first questions I ask is, are they willing to be a reference? And if the answer to that is no, it's why. And, some companies are very cagey if they're in a regulated industry, et cetera. But what I really want to get to the root of the matter is, are they experiencing success with the service? Are they getting real value? And if they're doing so, they should be happy to go on record that this is, an innovative piece of technology that they're delivering for their customers. And that's why we're so excited when we see companies like OpenAI and Tesla and Anthropic and LangChain and Vercel, talk openly about how they're using ClickHouse Cloud.
Yeah, you have some amazing customer study that's like incredible. Like, talks about like your PLG motion. So wanted to kind of go to like a bit of the future and the AI and your company. So the AGI scenario, right? Like a lot of your customers are obviously racing towards AGI, trying to be the first there. In that context, uh, does the database kind of become obsolete? Like, because if AGI happens, like, do they really need to like query on a regular basis, or they can just query once, have it in their context, where the context windows expand so much? How would that play out?
I think the database is going to be more important than ever. And I'll give you an example is, internally, we had some, traditionally static dashboards. They would refresh periodically and I would monitor the health of the business. And it was obviously built on ClickHouse Cloud. And so there was a real-time nature with a lot of flexibility. But I wanted to just start asking ad hoc questions about how the company was performing and not go to a data analyst and say, hey, I need a bar chart that shows me revenue distribution by region, or I need a graph that shows me new customer acquisition by cloud provider. I want to just ask a prompt like, hey, what are the top 10 customers that joined our service in AWS this month in financial services? And yeah, you could imagine all the different permutations of that. And so, we developed our own MCP server. We've integrated that with ClickHouse Cloud. And then we've got this agentic experience on the front end where anybody in the company can go in and just ask any question about how the company's performing. And in milliseconds or in seconds, depending on the complexity of the query, they're getting, those results and then a lot more insights into, the health of the company. And it's getting pretty sophisticated in terms of the modeling that you can perform. Like we've got this, 2.5 years of performance data sitting in a ClickHouse Cloud service. And I can ask it, we're closing the quarter today. Our fiscal year runs through the end of January. So this is being filmed on Halloween, October 31st. And so I can ask a question. All right, we're closing Q3 today. And this is all consumption based, as you know, from your time at Snowflake. So, we can look across thousands of customers around their consumption and kind of extrapolate based off their historical growth, what we expect over the next few months. So I can say, can you predict where we're going to finish the fiscal year 90 days from now, the end of January, and create 3 different scenarios for me? Create a pessimistic scenario where their consumption, decelerates, create a realistic scenario where it's just takes historical performance and extrapolates that, and then create a optimistic scenario where, they increase their consumption. We add more customers than we ever have before. And then, tell me what we can do to influence, a more favorable outcome. And the LLM, provides that and a lot more insight. So if you think about that as traditional BI, I just really think that sector is just going to be ripe for disruption, with the emergence of these AI capabilities.
No, I think like 100%. I think a good LLM model, MCP, and a great database combined is like amazing if you want to ask the right questions, especially if you're collecting the data in the right places.
Agree.
So, want to kind of talk a bit about like how as a from a culture perspective and some of how you think of growth to wrap this up. So you're a remote first company from what I understand. Like you have like different locations, and a lot of people in the valley say have asked folks to return back to the office. It's a 996 culture. Startups need to be like in person to succeed. What's your kind of like contrarian take? Because you are clearly successful doing it in a different way.
I often hear people take strong positions on this question and say, hey, it's got to be return to work. Startups need to be in the office, 996. And it's definitely not a one size fits all. Every company has its own unique characteristics that can make it successful or can cause it to fail. And, for us, the company was born during COVID. And so we were distributed on day one out of necessity. We talked about the cultural origins of the software and the need to have the team in Amsterdam. So we actually do have a strong physical presence in Amsterdam. We've got over 70 people, approaching 100 by the end of this year in the Netherlands. We have an office there. It's a great physical location for people to go into work. You see, I'm in an office right now in Menlo Park, California. So we do have some some physical real estate that we're able to utilize, but we don't have some, draconian return to work mandate that people need to be in the office a set number of days a week. We're too young, and we're growing so quickly that nobody wants to sign up for that type of oversight. And we also hire people that are extremely self-driven, and you don't need to look over their shoulder for them to produce really high quality work. And as I mentioned, we've got people in 20 different countries. And so, logistically, it's just unrealistic to open an office in each one of these markets. And as a result of having this distributed workforce, we're able to hire extraordinarily talented engineers and salespeople and other functions in Portugal or in Germany. And many of those markets, as you know, are already quite distributed. Like in Germany, we've got people in Berlin and Munich and Frankfurt. Like, I'm not going to open an office in every one of those locations, but the talent is so high that, we felt like having this distributed approach, makes sense and works for us. The other thing I'll mention as a kind of parting comment is, if you look at the management team that we have, and not just the founders and my directs, but it goes down the organization, they probably have more years of experience than your typical, 4-year-old startup. And they've worked at companies like Google and Netflix and Salesforce and others. And so there's just a level of maturity that comes with experience. There's no other way to put it. And again, if you've gotten this far in your career, you probably got a lot of, inner drive that it doesn't require you to feel like you've got your manager looking over your shoulder and counting the number of hours you're in the office.
That makes sense. And if someone's really excited about ClickHouse, what's the best way to like apply for a job or get in touch with folks there? Like, is it?
Yeah, our website, we post and list all of our roles. Almost all of them are location agnostic to an obvious certain degree. And so you come to the website, apply online. That's probably the most efficient way to get in the process. And we'd love to talk to you. We feel like we've got a great story to tell. Company's very well capitalized, so we're here for the long haul. And company's growing. And as you know, from your experience, there's no better feeling than being in a high growth environment.
Now you guys are amazing rocket ships. So it's like awesome to see like the success. So Aaron, to like wrap up, I have like a few rapid fire questions, and just curious, you can just give like a 30-second answer to these. So one benchmark everyone should recreate before buying analytics infra.
They should simply visit ClickBench.
Amazing. So most overrated metric in data infrastructure.
Most overrated metric in data infrastructure. Average ARR per customer.
Average ARR per customer. Interesting. VectorDB, it's a product or a feature?
It's a use case.
Use case. Oh, interesting. And can you elaborate on that a bit?
Oh, sure. You saw the emergence of popular vector databases like Pinecone and others, 5-6 years ago. I don't know exactly the time frame. And what I hear from customers now is they don't want a bunch of specialized databases. If they can use a database like ClickHouse for their analytics, for their transactions, for vector search, it simplifies their architecture and lowers their cost basis.
Makes sense. What 10x hardware or network improvement would make most change your roadmap at ClickHouse?
Well, for example, recently moving to Graviton instances within AWS has provided both better performance at a lower cost. So, and we're approaching other migrations with Google and with Azure.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Aaron, for joining and for taking the time out.
You bet.